In this lecture, we will be talking about US housing crisis and the Great Recession. Now, Great Recession started in December of 2007 and continued till June of 2009. The thing we'll try to understand in this lecture is how that Great Recession started and what were the factors that lead to the Great Recession. So question is, what started the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008? And we all know it started with housing crisis. And a housing crisis lead to financial crisis. Now, what does this financial crisis mean? What is the meaning of financial crisis? Financial crisis is a major disruption in financial markets that is characterized by sharp declines in asset prices and failures of many financial and non-financial firms. So it typically starts with the disruptions in the asset markets where there's a re-evaluation or revaluation of asset happens. And this financial crisis lead to a full-fledged economic recession. Now, what does this economic recession means? It means a period during which aggregate output is declining, which essentially means that aggregate output is your GDP or national income. So this is the period when which national income decreases. That means the overall income of the country decreases. Next question arises, the spark that started the fire, and there are two mix of two things that happen. One was a problems in a mortgage market. That means people defaulting on their mortgages. And we all know, if you remember the bank's balance sheet, mortgage is nothing but a loan that banks has given out. Now, if people stop paying back those mortgages, that means the assets, those loans go bad, which means that the asset side of the bank's balance sheet shrinks. And obviously, we'll all know assets and liabilities needs to match up. If assets are shrinking, which means something has to happen on the liability side, which we'll be talking a little bit later. Also, it also means financial instruments based on mortgages had the wrong prices, which is often known as economic bubbles. That means essentially in real world, it means that home prices were highly overvalued during this time. Those were the assets that were overinflated in terms of prices. Now, first is like, what does this economic bubbles mean? So, according to the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, there's a definition of bubble. It's an economic development in which the price of a class of physical or financial assets, such as house or securities, rises to a level that appears to be unsustainable and well above the asset value as determined by economic fundamentals. That means when price of an asset is overly valued, that's when the bubble happens. That means is overinflated. Obviously, during the housing crisis, the asset that was overinflated was the home prices. And let's have a look at that data. So this is the median sales price for new houses in the US during the period 1992 till the 2009. And what you see here, especially in this period around 2002 till 2006, the average or median home prices in the United States increased from around $180,000 to almost $260,000, which is close to 45 to 50% increase in a very short period of 4-5 years, which is a huge increase in asset prices. And just to compare that number in real life, think about how much your money grows if you put it in a savings account. Given that right now the interest rate on savings account is very close to zero, or essentially it's 0.01 or 0.02%. In those days, in 2006, 2007, yes, interest rates were a little higher, but nowhere close to anything that was giving you a 45-50% bump in your asset values within a very short period of 4 or 5 years. Now, question arises, what drove up the home prices? Why home prices were increasing? Now, again, to understand this, we need to understand some of the fundamental things that were changing in the United States. First was there was an increased demand for housing. Why there was increased demand? Mind you, a post 2001 dot-com bubble burst, we took some steps where we have been able to bring down the interest rate, and also the economy was doing great, so there was a huge increase in demand for housing. Obviously low mortgage rate because of low interest rate, which often translates into low mortgage rate. And the third important thing is the subprime market, and often known as ninja mortgages. What is ninja mortgages? It has nothing to do with the Chinese martial art. It's more to do with no income, no job applications for mortgages. So ninja stands for no income, no job application. That means people or individuals were issued mortgages by the banks with literally no income and no job. And often I'm talking about hundreds and thousands of dollars of mortgage. Now we'll come a little later why banks were doing it, why banks were taking so much risk. There's a set of reasons for that, which we'll be discussing a little bit later in this lecture. So this is the mortgage debt outstanding, and you can see how in the US mortgage debt outstanding has increased since 2000 to 2009-10. It increased from anywhere around 6 million, which is a $6 trillion, to close to $15 trillion. That's a huge increase in the mortgage or debt outstanding, because people were taking out mortgages to buy homes. If they have one home, they started buying two homes. If they have two homes, they started buying three homes. Everybody was engaged in this market heavily. And let's look at the interest rate. What happened to the interest rate? And this is a short-term interest rate or federal funds rate. And remember, federal funds rate is one of the target rates for the Fed. That's what they try to control. And based on federal funds rate, all other interest rates are set. And if you see here, post 2001 crisis, this is the 2001 dot-com bubble. So this is your dot-com bubble. What Fed did, they brought down the interest rate from around 7% here to down to close to 1%. Why they did it? They wanted to prop up the economy. We all know if interest rate decreases, investment increases. As investment increases, it increases aggregate demand, which also increases the GDP. Now that exactly happened. So when interest rate came down, people started buying homes, and homes are considered as an investment in national income accounting, which essentially propped up the economy. It was doing great. Obviously, you also know when economy does too well, it's kind of scary because Fed wants to keep the economy on a steady state. That means there's not too much of increase in asset prices because it can lead to bubble. So what Fed did, they started increasing the interest rate. And when they started increasing the interest rate, it created problem, which I'll be discussing in a bit. But major reason for this increase in mortgages was because of this decrease in interest rate that happened during this time. As a result, if you look at in this graph, which is the ratio of mortgage debt to GDP, that means you take the mortgage debt and you divide it by GDP, it increased from around, in 2000 it was around 60%. It by 2007-8 it was close to 100%. So the increase was from 60% to 100%. It became a huge part of the economy. Now question is, why the music stopped? Why things started going in the other direction or started going south? One was the rising interest rate that leads to increased mortgage default. The question is, why people started defaulting on mortgages when interest rates started going up? It's because of ARMs versus FRMs. What is ARMs? ARMs are adjustable rate mortgage, and FRMs are fixed rate mortgage. Now, what is the difference between ARMs and FRMs? Now, when you go and take out a mortgage, you have two options. You have the option of taking a fixed rate mortgage. That means if you're taking out a 30-year mortgage, your interest rate remains exactly the same, no matter whether you are paying in the first year or in the 30th year. However, banks also offer something called adjustable rate mortgage, which means that mortgages would be adjusted in a periodic fashion based on the market interest rates. Now, if you go and try to take out a mortgage right now, typically fixed rate mortgages are higher than the adjustable rate mortgages, because in the fixed rate mortgage, bank is taking higher risk, so they want a risk premium, and that's why often they charge a little bit higher interest rate than the adjustable rate mortgage. On the other hand, in the adjustable rate mortgage is the people who are taking out the mortgage or borrowing the money are taking the risk. During the 2001 or post 2001 crisis, when interest rate came down, many people took out adjustable rate mortgage because interest rates were lower than the fixed rate mortgage. However, when interest rates started going up, which we saw in the previous graph, and it started going up around 2004, 2005, what happened? Your adjustable rate mortgage was adjusted higher. And as the interest rate started going up on a huge mortgages, people's monthly payment starts going up. When monthly payment starts going up, that means many people couldn't afford to pay those monthly payments. As a result, they started declaring bankruptcies. What's the impact of that? There's an impact on excess housing inventory. Now, what is the excess housing inventory? Now, a lot of people have started moving out of their houses because they couldn't pay their mortgages. Now, banks are stuck with too many homes. We all know when there's too much of something, its price declines. Since there are too much of housing in the market, the home prices decline. This was also exacerbated by inability to refinance mortgages. So a lot of people try to refinance their mortgages, but when your home prices starts going down, it's extremely difficult to refinance your mortgages because banks don't want to take on that additional risk because of declining home prices. And finally, declining home prices leads to negative equity, which is a situation where you owe more on the home than what it is worth. That means you are paying for an asset money which is higher than what the asset is actually worth. When many people in this situation, they decided to default on their loans and declared bankruptcies. So this negative equity also lead to high number of bankruptcies, and as a result, banks ended up with a lot of bad assets. What happened into the median home prices? This is the period 2006 till 2009, and you can see that median home prices decline from around $260,000 to about $220,000. In a very short period of about 1.5 to 2 years, home prices or median home prices in the United States declined by close to $40,000. That's a huge decline in asset prices, and that creates another set of problems for the banks. So let's try to understand the vicious cycle of foreclosure and bank instability, how it affects the bank, how banks were in effect, because we all heard of how banks and financial institutions were bailed out during this process. Let's try to understand it. Suppose there's a housing prices decline, which essentially leads to negative home equity. Negative home equity leads to increased home foreclosures. That means people started moving out of their homes. They said it's not worth living in that home because its value is way below than the money they owed, which essentially increases the supply of homes. And when supply of homes increases, it leads to further decline in home prices. This is one vicious cycle where decline in the home prices has exacerbated the further decline in home prices. That's one set. Now, what does it mean? When home foreclosure increases, mortgage payments decline. And when mortgage payments decline, value of mortgage-backed securities decline. Now, what are mortgage-backed securities? These are basically all the mortgages that bank lend out. They took it together, put it together, they kind of sliced and diced it and sold it in the open market as an asset. When the value of this mortgage-backed securities declined, banks started incurring losses because many banks are holding these MBSs, which essentially means that bank capital declined. Remember, when bank incurs losses, that means that their assets are declining. If their assets are declining, liabilities needs to adjust, and capital is part of their liabilities. Banks cannot shrug on their deposits, shrug on the loans they have borrowed or money they have borrowed, but they can reduce the bank capital, which is shareholders' portion. Banks also restrict lending because their capital was declining. As a result, economic activity slows, and as economic activity slows, people will be buying less homes, or many of them who are owning homes, they will foreclose on their loan. So that's another set of vicious cycle that was going on during the housing crisis. Finally, the question arises, why banks took risky mortgage bets? And the answer lies in something called securitization. And what is securitization? That's basically mortgage-backed securities. Securitization is MBS. And what they do, this is the process where loans or other income-generating assets are bundled to create bonds which can be sold to investors. That means what banks did, they knew these are crappy mortgages because they're the one who issued it. So they didn't want to keep it in their balance sheet. So what they did, they took those mortgages, put it together and securitized it, which essentially means that they sold it to somebody like pension funds and other investment bankers. And they were a good source of income initially when people were paying on their mortgages. But things started getting sour when interest rate increased. As a result, people were unable to pay their mortgages. So between 1996 and 2007, that is in a period of about 10-11 years, the total amount of mortgage-backed securities issued almost tripled to $7.3 trillion. That's a huge increase in a very short period of time. And finally, the role played by credit rating agencies like Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. So if you remember, the role of rating agencies is to rate the investments or assets. And Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, these are the three major credit rating agencies. They never understood the amount of risk that was involved in mortgage-backed securities because everybody thought that home prices will always increase. That means those mortgages are pretty good. That means those are AAA grade investments. However, in reality, it was not so because home prices may not always increase. And what we saw was that home prices declined When home prices started declining, the assets which were backed by homes or mortgages, the value of those assets started declining. As a result, banks' balance sheet were completely off. So in the next lecture, we'll take up the case of Lehman Brothers to discuss what happened to Lehman Brothers, one of the biggest failure in the US history in terms of investment banking, and why Lehman Brothers failed. So just watch the next lecture about Lehman Brothers.